Hello and good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Hamilton, and I will be your MC for today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the SGI USA Washington, D.C. Buddhist Culture Center. In 2007, the SGI USA launched the Culture of Peace speaker series at its centers in New York, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Honolulu. The goal of this series is to convene conversations with leading thinkers and practitioners from a wide range of backgrounds and disciplines on those elements most needed to foster a more just and peaceful society. Today's event, a conversation on hidden bias, how it shapes our lives and the world, marks the 133rd event since the start of this series. And we appreciate the tremendous support we've received from so many outstanding speakers, as well as from you, and the many others who have taken time out of their busy schedules to join our conversations and to reflect on where each of us can begin to make a difference in our world. For those of you who are here for the first time, this beautiful building is the DC home for friends and members of the Soka Gakkai International Buddhist community. And we gather here to teach, study, and practice Buddhism in the Nichiren tradition. As an outgrowth of our religious activities, the Soka Gakkai International conducts a wide range of events in the arenas of peace, culture, and education to support the creation of a culture of peace. We invite you to visit this and our other centers throughout the Washington, D.C. area in the future.
Thanks. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. You know, I have to say that I'm Jewish on my parents' side, but my exploration of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sufism particularly have informed the work that we do. So it's particularly an honor to be here. When we first created this session, we wanted to talk about unconscious bias, but I was thinking that given what we've been dealing with of late, that talking about it, especially in the context of the fear that's present in our culture, might be very important. So what I'd like to invite you to do is just for a moment, turn to the person next to you and just take 2 minutes each and share to this question, you know, how is this fear that we're living in? And we could add, of course, hundreds of other examples. We could add the things that have happened just the last couple of days, the last couple of weeks in Europe, in Florida. It's not a limited topic. So just take 2 minutes each and share. I'll tell you when it's time to switch. So choose an A and a B. One person go first. The other person just listen. Go ahead and begin. All right, so let's bring that to a close for a moment, if we could. Let me get your attention back. Now, I've only got about 40 minutes with you, so we're not going to get into talking about policy issues around that. What we're going to really focusing on this morning is this afternoon, unpacking how it is that we as human beings relate to each other and to the world in a way that produces the kind of results we just saw. And I say we as human beings, not they as human beings. Because we all know that we all got this going on, right? Like I said, I'm Jewish. I know people who are Jewish who rail against anti-Semitism but then make a questionable racial comment. I know people of color who rail against racism and make a homophobic or heterosexist comment. And LGBT people who make comments about immigrants. You know anybody who got something going on with somebody? Right? So I want to approach this from the universality as it is, not saying that those are all the same because our societal context changes those. It's one thing to have a personal prejudice. It's another thing to have an entire system behind you that supports that personal prejudice. And so I'm not saying they're all the same at that level, but on a neurobiological level, the decisions we make, each of us are all the same. And that's what I really want to unpack a little bit. And I want to start with this question, which is how do we see the world? See, we all act as if we see the world as it is, but we all know that ain't true, right? You know, we see the world through a filter. And we're learning more and more about this all the time. It kind of starts with an internalized book of rules that we all have from the time we're growing up. We learn things. We learn things because we're told them. We learn things because we see them. We learn things because we're told the opposite, like don't do that. You know, we learn things in very subtle ways. So I learned, for example, if I go up to somebody like this, you know what that means, right? And how did the handshake feel? Yeah, okay. Wait, let's try somebody else. How'd that handshake feel? A little weak, right? Now, what's your name? Jennifer. Yeah. See, I intentionally shook Jennifer's hand in a way different from our normal American culture. Normal American culture is like a wrestling match. Damn glad to meet you, you know. But But I shook hands in a way that was more consistent with about a third of the world. If you go to South Asia or parts of South America, people use much softer handshakes. It creates more affinity in those cultures, and our handshakes seem dominating. But in our culture, in the United States, I'm talking when I say our culture, I mean in the broadest sense, that it doesn't only connote to weak in terms of cognitive, it feels weak. It's a visceral feeling that we have. How many people know what I'm talking about, right? How many of you have heard somebody say, if somebody shakes their hand like that with me at the beginning of an interview, forget it, I'm not going to hire them. Now think about how insane that is. Really, think about how insane it is. They could come from 1/3 of the world that doesn't do it that way. They could have an injury to their hand. They could be recovering from an injury to their hand. They could have a disability. And yet we use that as a way to make these decisions because that's the way we're organized, to try to find these quick heuristics, these quick problem-solving mechanisms that allow us to go through life quickly and safely. And it gives us schema. Schema are framing mechanisms of the mind that have us see certain things and not others. Each of us had these in our jobs. I was in Penn Station in New York a while back, and I had enough time to get my shoe shine that morning. So I was sitting in one of these, you know, if you've been there, they have these 15-bench-long shoe shine shops. So I'm sitting near the entrance, and I'm a people watcher, so I'm watching people walk down the hallway, and there are like 3 women, 2 men, and a child, you know. And I'm watching 2 of the shoe shine guys who are standing right in front of me, not 5 feet from me, looking for customers, and they're looking too, but they're not seeing the same thing I'm seeing. What are they seeing? Shoes, exactly right. You can see them, they're looking like this. The only time they're looking up is when somebody needed a shine. Need a shine? Yeah. If you ask them what they saw, they'd see 3 loafers, 2 sneakers, and a pair of floor shimes. Theoretically, we're looking at the same thing, but we see something completely differently. Now, this can switch in a minute. By the way, I know I talk fast. If you could listen fast, we'll get more done in the same amount of time. So let me show you what I mean. Take a look at this picture, and raise your hand if you see something recognizable in this. Obviously, if you've seen it before, don't do it. But if you've never seen this before and you see something recognizable, just raise your hand. What do you see? A bird, thank you. A woman. A woman, a cow, very good. A porcupine, somebody said? Okay, great. It's actually a cow. I'll make it easier for you to see just by doing this. Okay, now everybody see the cow? 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose. This is the forehead. Anybody who doesn't see the cow? We could stick around and do a remedial session later. Now I'm going to remove the superimposed picture, and tell me now if you can avoid seeing the cow in the original picture. Right? Something that was invisible just a moment ago, now you can't miss. This is the way the mind works. Experiences, things that we're exposed to, shape what we see and what we don't. And this is at the heart of one of the challenges we have in our culture. We're going to take it apart a little bit and explain why. But this is why the same thing shows up completely differently to 2 people, to 2 groups of people, to 2 philosophies. Watch MSNBC and Fox News any night, and you'll see what I'm talking about, right? So the schema gives us a background frame of reference that we use to see the world, and it becomes self-reinforcing. We see the world the way we expect to see the world. We gather that evidence which supports it and that which doesn't. It's almost like having a contact lens in your eyes, and the world looks blue to you. And you will sit here and argue with somebody else who has a red contact lens on their eye because those contact lenses were in essence put into our eyes when we were babies. We don't even know that they're there. We think the world is blue. And this is the way we walk around in life. So background creates context, and context is everything. Let me give you an example. Read that out loud for me. Okay, now read that out loud. So what is it, a B or a 13? Right? Somebody's arguing it's a 13. Yes, yeah. No. So the same thing happens in situations like this. Right? We see the same thing, we have completely different points of view. And we know that this is the world we're living in right now more than ever before. You know, we used to live in a bell curve society where you had a lot of people in the middle who had different opinions about different things, but they kind of crossed identities. So you had some people who were sort of liberal on this, more conservative on that. Some people who aligned more with Democrats on this, but Republicans on that. But it was like a big bell curve. Now we're living in a dumb bell curve society where everybody is on the extreme and nobody's in the middle. You know, and it's funny when we think of it, but it's painful when we watch it happening, isn't it? You know. John Kenneth Galbraith, the great diplomat, once said, and an economist once said, that most human beings, given a strongly held point of view and evidence to the contrary, will quickly go about refuting the evidence. And we've all seen ourselves do that. Yeah, but that's an exception to the rule so that we can keep the rule. See? So this is a phenomenon we call selective attention. I want to talk about in a minute, but the truth is we don't think the way we think we think. Now, my English teacher would have hated that sentence, but it's true. We don't think the way we think we think. And this phenomenon of selective attention is one part of it. Let me show you.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
And action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
How many of the educated, intelligent people in this room saw more than 2 or 3 changes? How many people saw no changes? Right. We're exposed to 11 million pieces of information at any one time. We can absorb about 50. And the things we pay attention to are the things we're oriented towards paying attention to. Now, this was nothing to do with intelligence. It had nothing to do with commitment or purpose. It had to do with the aperture of the mind. We see certain things. Now, it's funny when we see it this way. Shows up a little bit less humorously when we hear conversations about this. But the same thing is happening. For certain people, what they see when they see this is that. For others, what we see is that. And we wonder why we're arguing about the same thing. It's because our background, our orientation toward it is different. And so you sit and you listen to Bill O'Reilly, for example, go on and on and on about Black Lives Matter and how it's the worst thing that ever happened because other lives matter too. He's obviously looking at the first. When some of us who support the movement, we're obviously looking at the second, without even realizing we're looking at different things. Goethe said, we see what we look for and we look for what we know. It's not just what we see, it's what we hear as well. So I'm going to do a little experiment with you. What I'd like to do in just a moment, I'm going to ask folks over here to close your eyes. I'm going to play a 5-second video. I won't let them take your stuff. And over here, you watch the screen, and I'm going to ask you all what you hear. Okay? So close your eyes over here and watch the screen. Here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
Good. So open your eyes. So if you heard ba, ba, raise your hands. Look around the room. Keep them up high so we can see for a second. Okay, you can put your hands down. If you heard da, da, ga, ga, something like that, raise your hand. Interesting. I'm going to play it again. This time, open and close your eyes at intervals. You'll actually hear it change right before your eyes.
Ba, 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 ba.
Now, aside from being way cool, what does this teach us? We actually hear with our eyes more than we realize. In this case, it happens because the video is of him saying gaga, but the voiceover is of him saying baba. You actually heard what he said. For folks over here, the brain plays tricks with you. It tries to morph the two things, what it's seeing and what it's hearing. So it usually comes into a D sound for most people. But the point is that we hear through perception. This is why one person says something or does something and we hear it one way, another person does the exact same thing and we see it another way. Or we might hear because what we're primed to expect. I spent a year as professor of diversity in residence at Bennett College for Women in Greensboro, North Carolina. Any Bennett Bells here? No? It's a historically black college. And one day I was having lunch with the president of the college, Julian Malveaux, who's an old dear friend of mine, and 3 other people. And Bennett, being a Methodist school in the South, of course, we pray over everything down there. So we had to say a prayer before lunch, and we closed our eyes. And somebody said a prayer. Of course, it was a Christian prayer and evoked Jesus. And as I said, I'm Jewish. No, I'm not offended by that. My wife grew up in a Christian home. But it brings it up to consciousness. We open our eyes, the guy next to me turns to the person next to him and says, by the way, we also have Jews here. And I thought to myself, that was a nice attempt on his part to be inclusive. Until she responded by saying, no, water's fine, thank you. Juice, he said juice. But because I was sensitized, what did I hear? You know, this is the way we listen. I'm sure everybody here has had an example of something like that, right? You expected to hear one thing because that would have been what they would have said, and 10 minutes in you realize, wait a second, you're saying something different than I thought you were going to say. So we don't see the world, we don't hear the world like we think we do. Now this is problematic. If I were to say to you beforehand, before we start, how many of you think that your life experience impacts the interpretation of the world you see, everybody's hand would go up. And yet we don't live that way. We may know that, but we don't understand it really at a deep level. So we're going to look at actually I'm going to pass that. So we're going to talk just very quickly about the neurobiology of this. I'm not going to bore you with deep brain science or anything, but it is important for us to understand that our brains are actually designed to do this, that we can't survive without bias. That the same mental mechanism that has us know not to step into the street when that big heavy metal object with wheels is coming and say, I wonder what happens when it gets here, is the part of us that has us shy away from that person or lean into that other person. And this mental mechanism of the brain exists in every single human. The Dalai Lama has bias. We have to in order to survive. Sometimes it's life-saving, sometimes it's life-destroying. The question is not, do we have bias? The question is, what do we do with it, and how aware are we of how it impacts our behavior? So we know this because we've been studying, we've learned more about the mind and the brain in the last 20 years than we have in all of human history. And we know that basically the brain works in a pretty recognizable way. We see something out there, we'll call it a catalyzing person or circumstance, but we actually don't see that thing at all. We see it in the context of the filter that we're looking at. So for example, what's your first name? Catherine. So Catherine's wearing this light blue blouse. So I see Catherine for the first time, let's say, and I just have something about this woman makes me uncomfortable. Not true, Catherine, I'm just using it as an example. Something about this woman makes me uncomfortable. And so I get into protection mode in whatever subtle ways or extreme ways I might. Now, what I don't know is that something's getting triggered in my brain. That let's say, this didn't really happen to me, but let's say when I was in 7th grade, we used to have sock hops back then. Folks here are my age know what I'm talking about. Used to dance on the gym floor in our socks because the polyurethane in those days wasn't good enough for shoes, right? And the boys always lined up on one side and the girls always on the other side because heterosexuality was assumed to be the norm for everybody. And it was always the boys' job to ask the girls to dance. So this was my big chance, let's say, and there's this girl, Sally, in my class who I had a crush on, and this was my big chance. So I walk all the way across the room in front of all my friends, and I ask Sally to dance. And she not only says no, but she laughs at me. And so in front of all of my friends, I walk back, and my mind's saying, no, try it again, right? It turns out Sally was wearing a blouse that color. And in my brain, in the hippocampus specifically, I've linked that color blue with rejection. And I have no idea that that's happened. That's completely unconscious to me. But at that moment, something about Catherine makes me feel uncomfortable. This is the way we relate to the world. And we know the first part of that is to the fast brain. The fast brain is in the limbic system, in this green area here. I'll use my hand for a minute. Dan Siegel, who's a psychologist at UCLA, kind of taught me this. So if you imagine this is your brain, looking sideways at it, the limbic system is kind of where the thumb it would be. It's actually, it'd be better if I had two thumbs, but that'd be kind of weird. But it's deep inside of there. And the limbic system, very mechanical. The amygdala, we all know about the amygdala. It's had as big a decade as Brangelina. Is a radar system, scanning all the time for safety. And if you were to design a brain and evolve it for thousands of years, would you have it be more likely to look for danger or reward coming your way? Danger, of course, because you missed reward, nice surprise, you missed danger, dead. Right? So actually it takes about 20% more brain power to see something positive than something negative. We have to filter out negative before we can see positive. Quickly send a message to the hippocampus, the memory center. It's kind of like running over to the file cabinet. What is that? Oh yeah, blue shirt, danger. And then to the hypothalamus, the air traffic controller of the brain, which sends a signal out to our body as to what to do about it. This is the fast brain. Thank God we have it. Because if you were driving over here today and somebody stopped short in front of you and their taillights came on and you go to your slow brain, you end up in their back seat. Most of us know our foot hits the brake pedal before we even think about it. And that's why this is so critical to survival. So, now, this leads to projection, which is the main issue we have with how we relate to people. So let me give you an example, a couple examples of what I mean. I want you to imagine for a minute that you're you've got a son or daughter who's of age, and they call you one day. They say, Mom, Dad, I'm in love. I found the guy of my dreams. He's the one I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. And I'm going to bring him home next month for you to meet. And you're sort of overly anxious, so you go on Facebook. And you see two pictures on Facebook. You see this one and this one. Who are you hoping for? Well, as it turns out, this guy is John Fetterman. He's the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is an old steel town outside of outside of Pittsburgh, rather. That tattoo is his zip code. He's 6'11", 300 pounds, by the way. Has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard, served in AmeriCorps, did such an amazing job of revitalizing his community that he was reelected with over 75% of the vote and is now running for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania. This is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. Or, how do we relate to this picture versus this? Or who could tell me who these 5 women are? That's right, 5 United States astronauts. And is this a militia initiation? No, this is 2 men getting married the first day of marriage equality in the state of Washington. See, this is what we do. We make stuff up. This is the way the human brain works. We see an image and we make stuff up about it. We make stuff up about it. Now, we do have the capacity, the slow brain capacity. It lives in the prefrontal cortex, most amazing part of the human brain, 4 to 5 times larger than in any other animal, 2 to 3 times more active. It gives us the capacity to have thoughts like, what made me think about that? Now, that's unremarkable for us, but extraordinary in the animal world. If any of you have had a dog and put it outside and it sees a squirrel, you notice it doesn't seem to be saying, should I chase that squirrel? Right. We do have that capacity. Now, that doesn't mean we always use it, but to the degree that we get to the slow brain, we have more of an ability to be discerning. This is what meditation teaches people, of course. Meditation develops the capacity of the slow brain, of the prefrontal cortex area. This is why when I'm working with police officers, I'm teaching them breathing techniques on their way to emergent crime scenes. Because in order to do conscious breathing techniques, you have to move to your prefrontal cortex because that's the part of the brain that allows you to consciously regulate your body. So if they just do simply deep breathing on the way to the emergent crime scene, then they may have a split second longer to make the decision whether to pull that trigger. Now, that's not the only thing we do, but it's just, we can begin to teach these techniques. And the same thing is true for us. If you do some deep breathing before you go into that meeting you're terrified of, you'll be more present in the meeting. So, let's do a little test. We could show how the fast brain and the slow brain work. I'm going to show you a series of letter combinations. And what I'd like you to do is don't worry about what the letters say. All I want you to do is to read out loud the color of the font. Okay, so let's try one. Okay, I'm going to go fast. Let's see if you can keep up. That's good. Most of you know your colors. Okay, good. All right, that was pretty easy, right? Let's do it again. It was pretty easy. Pretty easy. Well, it wasn't that hard. Come on, we'll do it again. Here we go. Ready? Here we go. Yeah, what happened that time? Yeah? What happened was you felt the tug of war in your brain, didn't you? A tug of war between your fast and your slow brain. I gave you a very clear slow brain instruction. It was easy the first time. The second time, you gave yourself a fast brain instruction. It's an instruction most of us have been learning since we were 3 years old. Letter combinations make words. And that same tug of war happens when we encounter somebody we have a stereotype about. So let's see, what's your first name? Chloe. Let's say Chloe comes into an interview with me and I say to myself, I am absolutely committed to diversity in my organization. I absolutely think that women and people of color should have a fair shot. I am thrilled to have Chloe here for an interview. And I actually, honestly believe all of that if you put me on a lie detector test. Truly, I would pass the lie detector test. But underneath the surface, unbeknownst to me, are hidden biases that I have, implicit biases I have, connections that say somebody who looks like that is less than somebody who looks like this. And so it shows up subtly in that interview. It may show up in terms of how warmly I feel towards her. That's one way it might show up. I might feel more or less warm towards her, depending upon how comfortable I feel. Or it may show up through the competence that I associate with her. There's 2 different ways, but nonetheless, it's showing up. And so I have this kind of wrestling match. It's like, well, I really like her, but she's not quite as sharp as such and such. This is the nature of how the brain's actually working for all of us. Now, occasionally, And one of the challenges we have right now is it's no longer occasional in our culture, it's every day. We have something that charges the amygdala so much that what happens is what Daniel Goleman, the father of emotional intelligence, calls an amygdala hijacking. That the fear that's in our system takes over the entire system. And the system gets bathed in a whole kind of cocktail of adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisone and puts us on edge. And that's what we're feeling in our culture today. Most everybody walking around like this at various different levels. And we know what happens during these times. Three basic things happen when this is occurring to us. The first is our reactive responses, and that is fight, flight, or freeze. And most of us are familiar with that. You know, we either engage, disengage, or we're just shocked by it. The second, which is incredibly important for us to know, are protective responses. And usually what that means, because we feel out of control, in order to feel safe, we want to be in control. Or if we can't, we want somebody who will take control. If you look at what's going on right now, the turn towards totalitarian leaders, not only in this culture, but all around the world, is a result of that. Very similar to what happened in Europe in the 20s and 30s. That sense of societal disease. Maybe a strong person will come in and save us. And then the last is that our thinking becomes permanent, pervasive, and personalized, which is why polls now show that 2/3 of people living in rural environments in the United States are personally afraid of a terrorist attack. Now, there's no rational reason for that. But this is the way it happens. So what happens in this case? Once this happens, you take a group of people, whoever it is, and you know that, let's say, there are real threats among that group of people. So let's take this whole dramatic Islamophobic trend we're in right now. We know that there are some people who are using Islam as a supposed reason for their violence and terrorism. And so there are people who are dangerous there. But for the brain, it's much easier to turn that into a perceived threat to that whole group of people. Because you see, in our frightened brains, it's easier to keep all of them away from me than it is for me to figure out which ones are safe and which ones aren't. And this is the way stereotyping ends up with racism, sexism, you know, any of the isms that we're talking about, Islamophobia or whatever. It's easier for the brain. If I just keep all of you away from me, then I'm not going to have to worry about which of you are dangerous. And it's important for us to recognize the same thing's happening here. We might say the same thing could happen with Republicans or Democrats. Because I'm worried about all of you, I can't see the sum of you who I might be able to link up with, to connect with, to meet in the middle. And so that's why this dumbbell culture that I talked about was there. So fear intensifies bias. And I want you to be thinking about, we don't have time to really inquire into it right now, but how are some of these dynamics showing up in your world? You see, it's not just personal, our communities impact us as well, the communities we relate to. Most of us here, I'm sure, have heard of Maslow's hierarchy. Abraham Maslow introduced this model in 1943, one of the most foundational models in modern psychology. Maslow said that you had to have certain needs met before you ascended to other needs, and turns out he was wrong. Turns out that modern brain science is teaching us that belongingness is our key human need. And it makes sense if you think about it. You know, what's the most vulnerable time of a human being's existence? Newborn baby, that's exactly right. A newborn baby can't survive for the first 2 years of its life unless it belongs to somebody. So the first imprint we have is I exist because you exist. And as a result, being excluded from a group triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. No accident that most of the time when these terrible events happen, the person who commits the crime is described as what? A loner. That sense of social isolation. But it also leads to behavior that's just downright funny.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, He looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more.
Right. We laughed like we don't do the same thing. You know, how many of us have gone out to dinner with some folks? I'm not going to have any dessert tonight until everybody else orders dessert, and then it's like, well, all right, what do you know? This is the nature. See, and this accentuates because fearful times intensify the us versus them in us. And once we have an us, we want to act like our people. And of course, our people, means that they are abnormal, sinful, sick, illegal, unacceptable, outsiders, non-dominant or incapable. We, of course, are normal, righteous, healthy, legal, acceptable, insiders, dominant, and capable. And we reinforce each other. Can you believe what they did now? You're watching that station? This is the nature of who we are. And, we have this for a reason. Bias serves a function for us. It's our human danger detector. It keeps us safe. We learned very early in our evolution, when we were living in jungles and caves, that we had to determine really quickly whether that group around the waterhole was like us, because if we made the wrong determination, we died. So we learned very quickly to sort people, to figure out who's safe, who's not, who's smart, who's not, who's capable, who's not, who's going to serve me and who's not. And we know now, we got 1,500 studies over the last 10 years alone, and I could go on and on and on. I've probably got 500 of them in my computer. But I want to give you a couple examples of what we're learning about how this shows up. And in this particular case, I've chosen a couple around criminality because this is a big issue. Participants were shown a photograph of a dark-skinned suspect and a light-skinned suspect and told the same story about a crime that had been committed. They found that dark-skinned suspects were significantly more likely to be found for finding this ambiguous evidence to be probative of guilt. The participants who viewed the dark-skinned subjects were more likely to believe they were guilty, both on a scale and also guilty or not guilty. And you can see the pictures in this next. You can see these are exact same photographs, just one darkened and one lightened. And they also found that being told about William on the left versus Tyrone on the right, that people believed the evidence more, the negative evidence about Tyrone more than they believed it about William. It was like it had more stickiness if it met the stereotype in my mind. He looks more like a criminal. Obviously, I don't believe that, but I'm just saying this is what the mind says. And what they concluded was that the race of the plaintiff or defendant can act implicitly to cause people to misremember facts. Now, this is really important for us to get. It's not just I see somebody and I say, well, you're a little bit what's your first name? Mac. I see Mac and I say, well, Mac looks a little dangerous to me because I don't even realize that my mind has been filled with advertising, TV, movies that show people like Mac inordinately highly represented as criminals. It's not only that, but I start believing him less. I start valuing him less. Every part of me that wants to stay farther away from him represents itself in every way that we might interact with each other. And it gets even worse. In this study, which was done by Jennifer Eberhard, who is at Stanford University, she showed people pictures of criminals who have been convicted of capital crimes. She chose black-on-black crime because we've known for years that African Americans who are committing crimes against white people get harsher sentencing than against black people. It's like it's a worse crime if it was committed against a white person. So she wanted to eliminate that factor. She did black-on-black crime. She showed people images of the convicted criminals. And she asked them to divide them in two piles based on Afrocentricity of appearance, mostly darkness of skin. And then she tracked what happened to the actual criminals. Turns out that the ones with darker skin were 2.5 times more likely to get the death sentence. Now, if that doesn't send a chill up your spine, then you don't believe in criminal justice. This is the reality of what we're dealing with. And I could, like I said, I could go on. I could give you a study literally about any characteristic of human identity that you want. I could give you a study that shows we have bias around it. The question is not do we have bias. The question is which are ours. See, as my good friend Sukhvinder Singh Obi says, our brains seem to evolve to be good enough most of the time. Now, some of what we deal with is that we're primed to believe these things. Priming is a foundational phenomena of the brain that you can prepare people to believe certain things. Let me show you what I mean. Say silk. Say silk. Silk. Okay, good. Now, what do cows drink? What do cows drink? Water. Cows drink water. But I primed you to say milk. No? Now, how are we primed? What are some of the ways that we're primed? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Just two quick examples of how we're primed to believe the things we believe. These are two news stories that ran on consecutive days in Iowa, March of last year. Both of them were burglaries that occurred. The first story was of these University of Iowa wrestlers who were arrested, and here's the story. The second, four men who were arrested for almost an identical crime. Here's the picture that they showed. Now, is it boys just being wild, or is it criminals? Or here's another one. Watch this little news report from a Chicago news station.
Meantime, 2 teenagers are wounded on the city's south side. It happened at East 74th as an 18-year-old man and 16-year-old girl were hit while standing on the sidewalk. The male's in good condition while the girl's expected to recover. And kids on the street as young as 4 were there to see it all unfold and had a disturbing reaction.
No, I'm not scared of nothing.
When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
Because I live right here and I don't want none of my family members to get shot.
That is very scary indeed. So far, no suspects are in custody.
It was very scary, especially that 4-year-old boy. Really scary, isn't it? You want to get even more scared? I'm going to show you another video of that interview with the 4-year-old boy that was taken by a bystander with their cell phone.
That's what I like to hear. You ain't scared of nothing. Damn. When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
You are? Why you want to do that? You know what happens when
I'm gonna be the police.
Okay, well then you can have...
Little different message, huh? Little different message. And this is what we're fed. And we wonder why we think the things we think. You know, it's because we're constantly being fed in subtle ways. You know, you saw the video, you see that news video, you don't stop to think much about it. Now, I'm pretty suspicious because I've been in the media, you know, a number of times, and I've seen people take sections of things and use them in different ways. You get suspicious when it's happened to you or when you've seen it happen to somebody right in front of you, you know. But for the most part, we act like that stuff we see, the stuff we hear, that it's just all around us. So I do want to leave you with a few things that we can do about this, because we can take on personally a responsibility for doing something about this in ourselves. And as the Dalai Lama says, that's where peace starts anyway. It starts in ourselves. I mean, this is what the Buddha taught. This is what we know is true, that the more we are there ourselves, you really can't take people any farther than you've gone yourself. So the first one is to acknowledge the reality that people are dealing with. Not to try to change their reality, not to try to talk them out of their reality, but to just get where they're coming from through their lens. Because the chances are that their experience is shaped by things, and their interpretation is shaped by things that you were not shaped by. The second is to become an observer of how fear is impacting you, because most of what we're reacting to today is fear. The anger that we're having is fear. The isolation that we're having is fear. You know, the sadness is built on fear. And yet we deal with those surface emotions, but we don't deal with the fear underneath. This is one of the challenges we have in our dialogues. We get into these, we're not really dialogues, they're discussions. We're trying to pound each other into submission, this or that, as opposed to asking the question, before we start, can we talk about, what are you afraid of? What are your fears? The third is to practice observing yourself and telling the truth about your bias, to talk about it. And this means letting go of guilt. You know, guilt is actually a pretty counterproductive emotion. You know, it has a momentary inclination, but most people, when they get into guilt, contract. Have you noticed when you have somebody in your life who makes you feel guilty, you want to be around them more or less, right? Taking responsibility is a different thing. Guilt and responsibility are distinct. The metaphor I like to use for this, it's like the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. When you step on the clutch, the motor doesn't stop running, it simply stops driving the car. I can acknowledge that I have bias and say, oh, I got to watch out for that one. I didn't choose it. My mind wasn't programmed like that by my intention. It's been shown things and told things that I didn't choose to have to be told, but nonetheless, it's happened. So I've got this thing running. All right, there it is again. Got to be careful about that. And this is, again, where meditation can be an incredible tool. Carl Jung said, we can't change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. And the other is to embrace and explore that fear. To really turn towards it. What am I really afraid of here? Am I really afraid? Is Max? I'm sorry, Mac. I forgot you. Mac. Am I really afraid of Mac? Has he actually done anything to threaten me? Or am I projecting some fear on Mac because of some messaging that I got before? And how many of us actually ask that question? Rarely, in my experience. To also practice what I call constructive uncertainty, to take a pause every now and again, to turn our exclamation points into question marks. Rollo May, the great psychologist, said freedom is the pause between stimulus and response. That moment where we stop and say, all right, I feel like doing this. And it's funny how these things that 2,500 years ago this guy sitting under a tree taught are now being proven by science. For example, we've all heard, it's been in every action, count to 10 before you act, right? Yeah, the Buddha said, slowing down thinking allows wisdom to rise. We now know that when we pause, when we slow down, the slow brain rather, has more time to kick in. You can watch it on functional magnetic resonating imagery. This is not some woo-woo stuff, sitting on top of a hilltop in California with your, in a lotus position. This is actually chemistry. And one of the challenges we have is we have to start watching other media sources. And I know that's painful for some of us. Like, make me eat whatever, but not that. But we're growing up in a society that's very different than the society that many of us grew up into. See, it used to be that we all watched common news sources. And also, the news wasn't allowed to be interpretive. The ethics of the news said you never showed your opinion if you were a newscaster. And then so we all did that, and we went and then we interpreted it differently. Now we get pre-interpreted news, depending upon which one you watch, right? So for example, do you remember a couple weeks ago when the Democrats were holding that sit-in on the House floor? So since I started studying this stuff, and I did a whole section on my book, Everyday Bias, about how we elect our leaders unconsciously. So it's changed the way I watch the news. So I flip between news stations. So we're watching 3 stations that night, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox. And we watched MSNBC, and Rachel Maddow was on. It was 100% the Democrats on the House floor. Nothing else was covered in the 45 minutes I watched. Then we switched to CNN, same exact thing. Then I switched to Fox. In 40 minutes, it was not mentioned. You wouldn't have even known it was going on. And lest we point fingers, we know it happens the other way as well. So we have to be really careful that and then accentuated by your Facebook feed, your Twitter feed, your friends, and everything else. So we have to be careful to really pay attention to how the echo chamber we're living in. So we have to open a dialogue in a constructive way in our community and in our family, to really talk about this. Yes, this doesn't mean you can't have strong feelings. It doesn't mean you can't have a strong opinion. But what it means is, if you have a strong opinion, know that it's an opinion. That's different than acting like your opinion is the truth with a capital T, and they're idiots or evil because they don't agree with you. And that's the trap that mostly we fall into today. And to engage and learn with those who you consider to be others. So I want to leave you with one tool, a specific tool, and this comes from Elizabeth Lesser, who was one of the creators of the Omega Institute. She calls it take the other to lunch. It's a very simple prescription. And so you go out to lunch with somebody who you disagree with about something. And the purpose of it is not to convince them, it's to understand. So you start with that. You agree on some ground rules. First of all, we're not going to persuade, defend, or interrupt each other. We're going to be curious, authentic, and listen. That's the purpose of this whole conversation, is just to understand. And then you ask each other 4 questions. The first one is, what are some of your life experiences that have led you to feel the way you do? Very simple question. People get a chance to talk. Yeah. The second question is, what issues deeply concern you? What are you afraid of? The third is, I'll leave it up for a second. You can all take a picture if you want in just a moment. What have you always wanted to ask somebody from the other side? What question is killing you? Like, how could you do this? Or how do you see that? How do you not contradict, that sort of thing. And then the fourth and final one is maybe the most important of all, which is there anything you'd like to say to clean up the past with this person? So you know what? I have to admit that I've held people like you like such, and I apologize for that, and in the future I'm going to work towards treating you more humanly. Or I've assumed because you believe that, it also means you believe that. Whatever it is, to own it so you can actually let it go, because it'd be a line in the sand for us to move forward from. Good, so you got that picture? Good. And finally, to be an ally, to reach out. And being an ally doesn't mean taking care of people. This is one of the things that we had, those of us who, I started in civil rights work at the basement of All Souls Unitarian Church 50 years ago when I was 15 years old. And And in those days, of course, we were there to help y'all, right? Which is why you kicked our ass out of the civil rights movement at some point and said, we'll do it ourselves. Because that's not allyship. That's patronizing, right? Here's an ally. An ally says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. If we actually see our joint liberation is what we're after. And the only way we can do that is by creating communities of support. And the broader we make those communities, the more we make those communities look like the community in this room, the more we'll have a chance to have those conversations move forward. Great. Thank you.